I was not supposed to notice him. That was the first rule of surviving a season in the Loire. You did not draw the attention of Lord Julian Brandon, and you most certainly did not allow yourself to be caught noticing him. The other debutantes had learnt this quietly, the way one learns not to touch a flame. Not because he was cruel, because he was indifferent. And indifference, in a man of his standing, was somehow more devastating than cruelty could ever be. He stood at the edge of every room like architecture, like he had been built into the chateau itself, dark-coated, still, watching the performance of society with the detached patience of a man who had long since stopped expecting to be surprised. I told myself I had not noticed him. I noticed him immediately. But none of that would have mattered, none of it, if I had simply stayed in the ballroom that evening. If I had kept to the candlelight and the music and the careful choreography of being an unremarkable baron's daughter at a party far grander than her breeding. Instead, I wandered. The east corridor was cool and quiet, and I was so tired of being observed. I wanted 3 minutes of silence. That is all I wanted. What I found instead were 2 figures pressed into the shadow of a velvet curtain, breathless, secret, entirely scandalous. I stepped back. My heel caught my hem, and the crimson silk rose on my bodice. Hand-sewn, irreplaceable mine, tore free and fell without a sound to the corridor floor. I did not stop to retrieve it. By morning, the entire house party had one question burning on its lips. Whose rose was it? And Lord Julian Brandon, cold, controlled, unreachable Lord Julian Brandon, was standing in the breakfast room holding it between 2 fingers, his dark eyes moving slowly, deliberately, across every face in the room until they found mine. And held. Have you ever been caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment? Completely innocent, but with no way to prove it? Tell me in the comments below. And ask yourself, would you have been brave enough to do what Clara did next? If you are new here, welcome to a world of corsets, candlelight, and consequences. This channel tells the stories history forgot to romanticize. Subscribe, ring the bell, and come back every week for a new tale of love, honor, and the price of both. And if this story already has your heart, share it with someone who loves a slow burn. The Loire Valley Country House Party was not merely a social gathering. It was a precision instrument of the aristocracy, a mechanism by which alliances were forged, debts were settled, and the elaborate theater of matrimonial negotiation was conducted beneath a veneer of leisure. 40 guests filled the Château de Valençay that October of 1815, viscounts and their careful wives, ambitious younger sons performing nonchalance, daughters rehearsed in the art of being chosen, and above them all, in the particular hierarchy of a gathering like this, the figure of Lord Julian Brandon, heir to the Brandon earldom, a man whose silences were more communicative than most men's speeches. He was not unkind. He was simply closed, sealed, like a letter no one had ever been given permission to open. Clara Ashworth found him in the library before breakfast had properly concluded. She had spent the entire night deciding whether she was brave enough to do this. She had concluded she was not, and came anyway. "You have something of mine," she said. He looked up from his correspondence. The rose sat on the escritoire beside him, its crimson silk catching the pale morning light. "I am aware," he said. "Then you are also aware," Clara continued, keeping her voice level through an act of sheer will, "that I was not in that corridor for the reasons society will assume." He set down his pen. He looked at her, not quickly, not dismissively, but with that full, weighted attention that she would later come to understand was simply how Julian Brandon looked at anything he considered worth examining. "Tell me," he said. She told him everything. The wandering, the curtain, the fall, the 2 figures she could not clearly identify. Her innocence was genuine and entirely irrelevant, as both of them understood. In the economy of the ton, the appearance of impropriety and the fact of it were indistinguishable in their consequences. "So you need the rose to disappear?" Julian said. I need the truth to surface before the gossip hardens into verdict, Clara replied. The rose disappearing only delays the question. Finding the real answer ends it. He was quiet for a long moment. And you came to me, he said slowly. Because you found it, she said. Which means you were in that corridor too. Which means, Lord Brandon, that we are already in this together, whether either of us chose it or not. In post-Napoleonic France, a woman's reputation was not a personal matter. It was a family asset, as legally significant as property or title. Under the Code Napoleon of 1804, which shaped social expectation across much of Western Europe, an unmarried woman carried the full weight of her family's honor in her conduct. A scandal attached to her name did not merely diminish her matrimonial prospects. It could destabilize her family's social standing entirely, affecting her brother's careers, her father's alliances, and her sister's futures. Reputation was not vanity. It was infrastructure. Their alliance was agreed in 10 minutes. The most consequential 10 minutes of Clara Ashworth's life, though she did not know that yet. Julian would not reveal the rose as hers. In return, she would help him identify the true parties of the corridor encounter. For Julian had his own reasons for needing that secret resolved. They would be seen together publicly, not as conspirators, as a gentleman paying considered attention to a young woman of respectable family. The ton would watch. The ton always watched, but it would watch the wrong thing. The first evening of their arrangement brought a minuet. Julian danced with the economy of a man who had learnt form as discipline. Each movement precise, nothing wasted, nothing offered that was not required. Clara danced the way she did most things, with slightly more feeling than the occasion technically demanded. They were, the Vicomtesse de Morley noted from her chair by the fireplace, an arresting combination. In the measured geometry of the minuet, partners came close and drew apart, a choreography of approach and retreat that society had elevated to an art form. Julian was correct in every particular. His hand received hers at exactly the required moment. His posture maintained exactly the required distance. And yet when the figure brought her back to him, when his hand settled at her waist to turn her, it stayed a breath longer than the music strictly required. Not long enough for anyone watching to name it. Long enough for Clara to feel it like a change in the weather. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes forward, her expression pleasantly neutral, and said very quietly, "The woman wore a Norwich silk shawl. She was English." "There are 11 English women at this party," Julian returned, his voice low and even, giving nothing away except that he was standing close enough for her to hear it without effort. "She was tall," Clara added, and she laughed before she stopped herself. The figure of the dance turned them apart. When it returned them, his hand found her waist again. And this time, she was almost certain, his fingers settled with a fraction more deliberateness than before, as though the first time had been reflex. And this time was a choice. Clara kept her eyes on the middle distance. She said nothing about it. Neither did he. Note how Julian controls the terms of their arrangement entirely. Clara accepted an alliance whose conditions he set, in a space he chose, on a timeline he managed. In the social grammar of 1815, a young woman had precious little room to negotiate with a man of his rank. Protection offered from a position of power is not always neutral. Always observe who holds the terms. The second day brought rain, which drove the party indoors and compressed 40 people and all their attendant tensions into the chateau's grand reception rooms. It was in the afternoon, during the general migration toward the card tables, that Julian fell into step beside Clara near the long windows overlooking the parterre. They stood side by side, watching the rain sheet across the formal hedges, and spoke in the low, unhurried tones of two people who had established, without quite discussing it, that direct eye contact was a luxury they were rationing. "My brother," Julian said, without preamble. Clara waited. He was in that corridor, with a young woman named Celeste de Fontenay, the Baron's daughter. They are attached to one another. Genuinely so. But Theodore has not the means to marry yet, and a scandal would force the question before either of them is prepared for the answer. So you are protecting them, Clara said. I am attempting to, Julian replied, and something in his voice shifted. Almost imperceptibly, a hairline fracture in the usual composure. Theodore is not careful. He never has been. I have spent a great deal of my life standing in the gap between his choices and their consequences. Clara looked at him then. She could not help it. In profile, he was all clean line and controlled stillness. Jaw set, eyes fixed on the rain. But she had learnt in 48 hours of careful observation to read the smaller things. The slight tension at the corner of his mouth. The way his hands, when he was not performing composure, tended to clasp behind his back, as though he were physically holding himself in a posture of restraint. That must be, she said quietly, extraordinarily lonely. He turned to look at her. It was the first time she realized he had looked at her in full. Not the measuring glance of the library, not the guarded surveillance of the dance floor, but directly, without the usual layer of management between his expression and his face. He said nothing. He did not need to. The physical language of the Regency and Restoration eras was a study in constraint and subtext. In a society where an unchaperoned conversation between an unmarried woman and a gentleman could itself occasion comment, the permitted vocabulary of touch was extraordinarily limited. A hand received for a dance, a gloved greeting, perhaps an offered arm on a garden path. Within these narrow permissions, every deviation carried enormous weight. A hand that lingered a beat too long, a step not taken back. These were not small things. In the grammar of the era, they were entire sentences. It was on the third evening that the arrangement came nearest to its end. A supper concert had drawn the party to the music room, and Clara, positioned near the back, heard what she had been waiting for. That low, delighted laugh, quickly suppressed, drifting from just beyond the connecting door. She moved without thinking. Julian, who had spent 3 days watching her without appearing to watch her, moved 2 seconds after. They found themselves alone in the small anteroom. The music filtering softly through from the next room, the corridor still and dim around them, standing closer than the terms of their alliance had ever required. Lady Priscilla Fontaine, Clara breathed. It was her laugh. I am certain of it. Julian went very still. Then Theodore is clear. Completely. The relief that moved across his face was not dramatic. It was the quiet kind, the release of something held too tightly for too long. His eyes closed for just a moment, a single slow exhale escaping him. And Clara, standing close enough to be entirely aware of the warmth radiating from him in that narrow room, did something she had not planned. She placed her hand, briefly, barely a second, on his arm. He went still, not stiff, not withdrawn, simply arrested, as though that small point of contact had interrupted something in him that he did not know how to resume, as though he had forgotten entirely what the next movement was supposed to be. When she lifted her hand, the air between them held the memory of it like heat held in stone long after the fire has gone out. It is over then, Clara said softly. No more alliance. No, Julian agreed. Neither of them moved toward the door. The music continued in the next room, unhurried and quietly insistent, as though it had not noticed that everything had changed. The final night brought a supper dance, informal by Valençay standards, which is to say merely magnificent rather than overwhelming. The chandeliers burned at their fullest. The scent of beeswax and late autumn roses moved through the gilded rooms like a slow tide, and the Loire beyond the long windows lay silver and still beneath a cloud-threaded sky. Julian sought Clara for the waltz. This in itself was communicative. The waltz was the most intimate of the era's permitted dances. Partners facing one another, close enough for private conversation that no one else could hear. The gentleman's hand resting at the lady's waist for the full duration of the music. The ton watched who waltzed with whom as carefully as it watched anything at all. His hand found her waist. Clara had danced with him twice before. She knew the shape of this, the correctness of his posture, the precision of his lead, and she had prepared herself accordingly. She was not prepared for the difference. It was not dramatic. He did not pull her close in any way the room could remark upon. He did not do anything the most watchful matron present could have named with certainty. But his hand, that careful, disciplined hand, rested at her waist with a warmth and a steadiness that was simply, unmistakably, not the same as before. When the waltz turned them, when the music brought her fractionally nearer, he did not create the small, polite correction of distance that propriety suggested. He let her be near. More than that, as they moved through a slower passage of the music, he angled his head, almost imperceptibly, toward the curve of her hair. Not enough for any observer to name. Not enough for Clara to be entirely certain she had not imagined it. But she felt the slight, deliberate stillness of him. The way his breath came, and then did not, for just a moment, as though he were committing something to memory, as though the faint scent of her, rose water and something warmer beneath it, was a thing he intended to keep long after the evening had ended. She did not move away. They danced in silence for a measure, then two. "You never told me," Clara said quietly, "why you were in the East Corridor that night." "No," Julian agreed. "I had followed Theodore," he said at last. "I arrived too late to prevent it, and too early to pretend I had not seen. So we were both simply present," Clara said, "at the wrong moment. Or," Julian said very quietly, "the right one." Clara looked up at him. The candlelight caught the sharp planes of his face, and she saw, perhaps for the first time without obstruction, that the composure she had spent 4 days reading as coldness was not coldness at all. It was care. Immense, disciplined, almost painful. Care. The expression of a man who had decided very young that the safest way to love something was to guard it from a distance, and who was finding, for the first time in 20 years, that the distance had become unbearable. His thumb moved, once, against the silk at her waist. So slight she might have invented it. She did not think she had invented it. When Julian's thumb moved against Clara's waist during the waltz, that was not small. In 1815, touch between unmarried people was so restricted that even that single movement carried the weight of a declaration. He could not say the words, so his hands said them. "Lord Brandon," she said softly. "Julian," he said. And the single word, spoken in that register, in that room, with his hand warm at her waist and the waltz turning slowly around them, was not an introduction. It was a door left open. We did not speak of it that evening. Not directly. Not in words. Some things, in that language of gloved hands and lowered eyes and thumbs that moved once against silk, did not require words. They required only the courage not to retreat, to stand in the warmth of something unplanned and let it be what it was. I have thought since about what it cost him. Not the alliance, that was strategy, and strategy came naturally to Julian. But the waltz, that single, barely perceptible yielding of the careful distance he had maintained for 20 years. That cost him something real. And I have thought about what it cost me. Not the rose, not the scandal risk, not the 4 days of whispered investigations in dim corridors, but the moment in that anteroom when I placed my hand on his arm without permission, without calculation, without any guarantee of how it would be received. That cost me something too. This is what I understand now, standing on the other side of that autumn at Valençay. Sacrifice is not always a grand gesture. It is not always the thing the histories record or the poets dramatize. Sometimes sacrifice is simply the willingness to put down the armor you have spent a lifetime constructing, and trust that the person standing across from you in a candlelit ballroom is worth the exposure. Julian was worth it. I believed even then, before he had said a single word that could be called a declaration, that I was worth it to him too. Not because he told me, because of the way his hand stayed at my waist one breath longer than the music required, because of the way he went still and breathed and remembered. Some things do not need words. They only need the courage not to pull away. The truest sacrifices are the ones no one witnesses. The walls quietly lowered, the distance quietly closed, the heart quietly offered without ceremony or guarantee. If this story moves something in you, if you have ever loved someone quietly from a careful distance, waiting for the courage to stay, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling me which moment held you the longest. Was it the waltz? The anteroom? The rose? I read every single one. Subscribe for a new story every week. And until next time, remember, the most powerful love stories are never the loudest ones. They are the ones told in a single, lingering touch.